If you've spent any time in the online ancient Christianity space, whether on YouTube, Reddit, or TikTok, you've probably seen the same topics pop up over and over again. The Gospel of Thomas, Gnosticism, the Valentinians, Marcionism. There's something seemingly irresistibly mysterious about these varieties of early Christianity. Maybe it's the appeal of hidden or alternative or esoteric knowledge. Maybe it's the continuing Dan Brown Da Vinci Code effect, the whole notion that this knowledge was long suppressed by the church. Whatever the reason, these texts and movements from early Christianity are very popular. Religion for Breakfast itself first took off because my videos on the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas years ago started to go viral. But behind this virality, there's some serious scholarship. These are complex topics, and few people are doing that work better than Dr. David Litwa. Dr. Litwa is a scholar of early Christianity and the author of over a dozen books, including The Evil Creator, which is about the Demiurge, The Gnostic Thomas, an introduction to the Gospel of Thomas. Dr. Litwa's work explores how early Christians imagined salvation, divinity, and the cosmos, but he focuses especially on groups that have since been labeled heresies. But he's not just a scholar writing for other scholars. Dr. Litwa is a public scholar and a content creator. He runs an amazing YouTube channel, he's leading a guided tour to Egypt that you can join, he teaches online classes, and he's also giving a live online lecture with us soon about Marcion, which you can learn more about by following this link here. I've been a longtime fan of Dr. Litwa's work, not just for the depth of his research, but for his ability to make notoriously complex material accessible to a wider audience. So I was very excited to sit down with him to talk about Gnosticism and Hermeticism, throw a little bit of shade at academia, and discuss why so many people today are still so captivated by these lesser-known varieties of early Christianity. So without further ado, here's Dr. Litwa. So I'm here with Dr. David Litwa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It is fantastic to be here, Andrew.
So, I love what you study. You study Gnosticism, Hermeticism, the Demiurge. These are the sorts of topics that just get a lot of views on YouTube. There's something about these topics that make people very excited, more so than, say, like Intro to the Apostle Paul or something like that. Why is it? You've been doing this online education thing for a few years now, online content creator. What is it about the topics that you study, like Hermeticism or Gnosticism, that you think gets people so excited to study these things?
Well, I think there's two voids in the modern culture. So there's that educational void or gap where people either can't afford to, or they don't have time to, or they don't want to travel to go get education in these topics, which have been classed under esoterica. Esoteric topics are what Wouter Hanegraaff calls rejected knowledge. So they're classically topics that have been rejected by Western rationalism as unimportant or insignificant. But there's a huge amount of people still interested in them, and there always has been, generation after generation. So there's this gap. Where do you go? And even if you had a local university, down the street, and you knocked on their door and said, I want to take a couple of night classes. Well, chances are, if they have a religion department, that would be great. But they'll be doing Intro to New Testament, not Intro to Magic. Or they'll be doing not ancient mystery cults, but the life and work of Paul. And that's not to say that there's not an intersection between New Testament studies and mysticism. There's a famous book called Paul and Mysticism by Schweitzer. So there's been interest in that. But historically, that need just hasn't been fulfilled by the traditional academy. And there's also this sense where Western rationalism, and this is what I think of as the second void, is I think the problem that a lot of people have is that the average person is also interested in the spiritual meaning. They, of course, love the fact that you can give them the history behind, say, the Gospel of Thomas, or you can tell them when you think it's written and where. I published an article arguing that it's written in Alexandria. So I that's my own particular take. But I think what I've noticed in working on online education is that this isn't dry and dusty material for most people. This is stuff that people actually want to live and implement. So we're in an age where we can follow that line of, Pierre Hadot, kind of like we learn the philosophy, we learn the topics that we're interested in, because in a sense, the audience, at least my audience, also wants to live them to some extent. You've got some burned out Christians who are trying to tap back into their own tradition, maybe after 50 years of, never going to church. And they just want to see if there was another side to it, if there's something that they might be able to claim. And that esoteric side of Christianity, it's not like, it disappeared. It was always there. It was just really never studied. And so, yeah, being online, it gives you that chance to fill those gaps.
I never thought about that angle about feeling a yearning to live out what they're interested in. So especially for something like Valentinian Christianity, or Sethian Gnosticism, as it were, that are so quickly labeled as heresies, we sometimes forget about them as, once living traditions where people were trying to live out particular ethics or a particular philosophies. What can you say about what? Maybe we can take Valentinian Christianity as an example, but you can pick any example you like. What does that tradition offer in terms of living an ethical life, or what a disaffiliated Christian today might find value in?
Well, there's been a lot of interesting and fascinating work recently on Gnostic morality. There's a great book. Ismo Dunderberg did both Beyond Gnosticism, and he did a collection of essays called Gnostic Morality Revisited. And I think it's fantastic what he does. One of the things that is just illustrative of Valentinian ethics is, so you've got the myth of wisdom, right? Or the story of wisdom, if we don't want to use a loaded term like myth. We've got a story of wisdom that Valentinians knew. It's where she goes and tries to learn who the Father is. Alternatively, she wants to produce aeons like the Father, but her heart is in the right place. So she wants to know the Father, but then in a sense, she's beaten back, and the thought that she has, it can't contain the Father, and it's essentially, shot out like a miscarriage from the fullness. And, in this story, when you read Irenaeus, he's like trying to bring out the most bizarre elements of the story and trying to make you think like, oh my God, this is weird. I've never heard of this. This is absolutely crazy. And I think that's a lot of people's reaction to the myth. And one of the things that Ismo does is, I think he brings home the ethical implications of this myth. So part of the myth is that when wisdom causes this disruption, that she is overcome with these strong, violent, wild emotions, which the ancients called passions. And in fact, they name 4 passions, which the Stoics named as like classic categories for how you think of the passions. Those like primary passions, like grief are lupi, and in Greek, that's what wisdom is feeling. And in the story, you've got Christ coming to her, and the very first thing that he does is heal those passions. And that is very, very important to the story, that wisdom calms down. And then when she sees Christ, her passions are not only calmed, not only in a sense rooted out, but she has what are then can be thought of as positive emotions. And those positive emotions that she has, joy, in the face of Christ, it's said that she veils herself out of a sense of dignified shame. Those positive emotions that she experiences then actually produce us, basically. I mean, the spirituals. So what Dunderberg does is he shows this isn't just a story. This isn't just a weird story. It's actually a story training people how to calm their passions. It's, first of all, at bare minimum, showing people these unruly negative emotions are really the core of what we think of as vice. And that's really just such a traditional philosophical position. That's what Platonists are saying, is what Stoics are saying. And so the ethical life is at least partly to simply get rid of either attain a state of metriopathia, which is the balance of the emotions, or to attain a state of eradicating those passions, and are at least progressing toward that eradication. And that's essentially what happens to wisdom. And the very life of the universe is her learning how to eradicate those negative emotions And we are, in a sense, part of that training, part of that gymnasium. As wisdom's children, we're helping her by getting rid of our passions and then replacing them with positive, good emotions. And I think, it's a way that the myth is brought home, because I think one could get the sense from Irenaeus that the myth really is truly meaningless. But if you tell such a story, it should have an impact in your religious community. Admittedly, it's educated guesswork, but I think it's brilliant, a brilliant analysis. And that's only a small piece of the pie of the really exciting work that is done on Valentinian ethics. In fact, there's a book by Philip Tite by exactly that title, Valentinian Ethics, in which he looks at the Tripart Tractate and the interpretation of knowledge and brings out some really incredible insights, thanks to Nag Hammadi and that great resource where we can actually hear the Valentinians themselves.
Yeah, and I like this. So something I try to do in my own videos is I think this is a mantra in religious studies, which is to make the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. So we're so quick to take things for granted, especially if we're coming from our own particular cultural or religious background. So when we hear the Apostle Paul write about the Holy Spirit, we're very quick to make assumptions about what that means, filtered through our own interpretive lens or particular theological lens. And when we read something like a Nag Hammadi Codex and the Tripartite Tractate, like these are really difficult to understand texts that are then very easy to exoticize or even kind of make fun of, like these kind of bizarre invented myths about eons emanating out from the one, and so it's quick to dismiss them. But what you've just been describing over the past few minutes is kind of making the unfamiliar familiar, where this is a moral and ethical framework in many respects.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Valentinian pedagogy itself, so Harry Attridge has this great article on the Gospel of Truth as an exoteric text. And basically the argument is that whoever gave that sermon or a sermon-like, speech, knew much more about the backstory of wisdom and, the aeons and et cetera, but they presented the material in a way that anybody walking through the door can understand. They didn't dumb it down, but they presented it in a sense that it was accessible to all. And it's really important to remember in the Gospel of Truth, there's this great passage where, most of it is kind of metaphysical musings, but there's this one scene where he just turns a corner and says, you know what, and gives this ethical exhortation. And it's just so simple, like heal the sick, reach out your hand to the needy, give alms, rouse those who sleep, and it's just so basic. And of course, I think if someone is still in the Hans Jonas paradigm of Gnosticism, where it's like, oh, well, if you're a Gnostic, then you have to, have this awful reversal of value and gleeful perversion of everything, every good norm, and utter lawlessness and transgressiveness. And, this passage is just staring you at the face that you can't make everything a metaphor. I mean, feed the hungry, is that is there a spiritual meaning to that? Well, I mean, probably not. I mean, you can just take it literally here. It's okay to do that, even though it's a Valentinian text. So it's not like the Valentinians were so otherworldly, like they're only doing metaphysics, in a room, as if they were just brains in a bottle. I mean, they do actually help people, and they do actually do things like get together and have a meal and perform a ritual. And, we have inscriptions of I think you've done a video on Flavia Sophia inscription. I mean, they're real people with real concerns and also ethical concerns.
So let's pivot to Hermeticism, because you have done some interesting work too on Hermetic ethics and morals. Maybe give us a little bit of backstory of what Hermeticism is, and then draw out what sort of morality was being put forth by those writers.
Sure. Yeah, I just published Hermetica 1, which is I guess I worked backwards. I did Hermetica 2, which is the There's two main kind of sources for Hermetica that people think of. There's the Corpus Hermeticum that was discovered in the Renaissance, which is a set of 17 tractates that moved from basically, the Byzantine Empire to Renaissance Italy. But a much earlier source for the Hermetica is Stobaeus, who's this early 5th century. Basically, we don't know much about him, but he wanted to write a book of excerpts for his son, and he wrote down tons and tons of Hermetic excerpts, including what appear to be whole treatises. So that's Hermetica 2, and Hermetica 1 is that, the Corpus Hermeticum, what most people are familiar with. And that has traditionally been translated with the Asclepius, which is a Latin work, which kind of, I think of as a kind of like Hermetic. It's clearly someone who put that together was like wanting to have a theory of everything. I mean, it basically like it's a little encyclopedia, where they kind of like seem to have combined different tractates on, basically anything and everything. But it's got some very nice purple passages. And then as a subset, you've got the Hermetica discovered at Nag Hammadi, which has really blown open the field, and has confirmed, I think, a hypothesis, that's actually quite early, that, these were real people, they had real experiences, and what they're writing down could fall under the category of religious mysticism. It appears that they are concerned about like ascending. They have they've got the heavens mapped out. They talk about an Ogdoad, which appears to be an 8th region above the 7 planets. And then they've got an Ennead, which is the 9th region. And they talk about going there and singing and becoming a power and how you do that. And so it's a very interesting spiritual movement that most people have like claimed as kind of like the roots of Western spirituality. There's all sorts of perennialists out there who try to say that there's a continuous tradition. In a sense, that's right, because it's not that the West ever forgot about Hermes and the Hermetic tradition. The Corpus Hermeticum did come into Renaissance Italy, but it's not that, Thomas Aquinas would have known the Hermetica. Albert the Great, his teacher, knew tons of Hermetic writings, and he cited Hermes all the time. So it's not like we forgot. But I think one of the exciting bits about finding new Hermetica is that we've got to see that this is basically native Egyptian philosophy or spirituality. Some people want to call it theosophy. It's a bit anachronistic, but anyway, it seems to be native Egyptians wanting to do philosophy, and they're writing in Greek, and they're presenting basically what appears to be a religious movement with roots back in Egyptian priestly culture. But they've got the Greek cosmology in there. They've updated themselves. They're, scientifically up to date in terms of the 2nd century and 3rd century. So, and they're always bringing forth new material. And as time went on, they not only talked about philosophical topics, they talked about astrology and alchemy, and all that stuff was added as, part of the Hermetic gnosis, as it were, that field of knowledge. So basically, yeah, it's an accreting tradition where you can ascribe any mystical, spiritual, or scientific mystery, back to this Hermes, this great sage of Egypt, and then your text becomes Hermetic. There's really nothing else that makes a text Hermetic besides being ascribed in some ways to Hermes. And I think it's a great it's a great read. If you haven't come across it, it really combines a lot of things that the West has divided, science and spirituality. It's all one thing. And I think that, in the early 20th century, there used to be a lot of interest in the Hermetica and the New Testament. New Testament scholars have completely dropped the ball there. They don't even know what the Hermetic is practically. And yeah, unfortunately, in our world, New Testament scholars don't learn any Hermetica or any Greek mythology. I mean, they have to go and sort of learn that by themselves. But there's a lot of people out there whom I've talked about earlier, those spiritual seekers who have found the Hermetica, and it's been very useful for their spirituality, and so they want to learn more about it. So hopefully my platform will be that place where they can get some good, reliable information.
Yeah, it is interesting how there's such a siloing effect in the academy. I've experienced this myself. I mean, I study late antiquity, a lot of magic and demonology, which kind of lends itself to, jumping between traditions, as it were. But even with my training, like I found myself discovering Manichaeism and Mandeism, and like all these other religious communities that were active and thriving in late antiquity, quite late in my research. Like, and I was like, why did I not learn this like year one, semester one of my PhD program? Because it's not like these traditions were as siloed as our academic departments are today back in antiquity. So when you were describing like Valentinian morality, for example, I'm like, oh, that sounds a lot like Stoicism, and they're probably up on their philosophy. And you were saying how the Hermetic corpus shows, or the Hermetica shows being up to date on everything from philosophy to science. So it's not like there was the siloing effect. And it's just curious how that happens.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate effect of where the expansion of knowledge occurs in the details. So, there's every year, I used to work at Boston College for New Testament abstracts. And yeah, every year there's 100 commentaries published. And honestly, I'm not sure if anything new can be said about individual verses of the Bible, but it would take you 100 years just to get through the commentaries. So the specialization has created a situation where, yeah, just in New Testament studies, maybe 500 books a year are published, maybe even 1,000, who knows? And no one can keep up to date with the field, so they don't ever venture into anything else. I mean, because they'll never get to the bottom of Romans 3:23 and all the commentaries, But yeah, you're right. I think the ideal educational system would be not more shallow, but would have intros to things like Greek mythology, Homer, who's pervasive, Euripides, Plato, bit of Greek philosophy. You've got to get the Stoics and the Epicureans in there. And you can't forget these spiritual traditions, Greek mysteries, Roman ruler cults, a lot of the things actually that you've done on the channel, these things that, unless a New Testament scholar gets really interested in, say, like anti-imperial rhetoric, they're never going to study the Roman ruler cult, which is like one of the most pervasive religions, or religious expressions in that period, particularly in the first to third centuries of the Common Era.
So in the New Testament too, like the Book of Revelation, exactly. Try to understand that without understanding the imperial ruler cult.
Right. Yeah. So it just so happens that, yeah, people talk about contextualizing the New Testament, but really the average person is almost like the canon still is king, right? Like by contextualizing Paul, it doesn't mean you study Marcion. It means that you study the pastorals plus Ephesians. It's like that boundary of what is the context of something that really needs to be exploded. One of the great examples of a person in antiquity who was living in, a multicultural world is the Nicene preacher, who has this great sermon in the Refutation of All Heresies, sometimes ascribed to Hippolytus, but I just call him the Refutator because it is an anonymous text. And it's this sermon where he's saying that I found Christ in all these mysteries, including mysteries that most people have never heard of, like the mysteries of Attis and Cybele or Cybele, if you prefer. And he's got Osiris in there and Isis, and he's clearly knowledgeable about, a ton of like phallic imagery, which is like, oh my God, does a Christian talk about this stuff? But he's just like this. He's like literally this walking encyclopedia, and you're like, what world is this guy coming out of? Like this is what he talks about. And also the Gospel of Thomas, so at any rate, like this is a very highly multicultural world. And for whatever reason, even though we pride ourselves in being multicultural too, our academies are actually really boring places sometimes. Uh, anyway, I don't mean to complain.
Yeah, and I don't want to shit on the academy too much, but I'm speaking a lot from my own experience, where I've been recently doing a foray into early Islam on the channel, and I'm like, so much of this is fifth, sixth, seventh century, which falls into my subfield of late antiquity. Why did I not study Safavidic inscriptions from fifth century Jordan? Because this would have been helpful for what I was researching. But like Islamic studies, early Islamic studies is going to be in a completely different department and offering classes that I didn't need or wasn't required to take. So part of me was like discovering this field in years after my PhD, like, oh, why did I not study the Mandeans more? Why did I not study early Islam more? Especially because my research was going further and further east into the Eastern Mediterranean. I was studying Syria, I was studying the Levant, and I just never was. I either wasn't curious enough to do that outside my wheelhouse research, or it just wasn't being presented to me because I was surrounded by other biblical studies scholars who were like, oh, of course we're going to now study. I took a New Testament class, even though it's earlier than what I researched. I took a class on Rabbinic Judaism, so I was like kind of staying in the wheelhouse, as it were, when there was a lot that just one step further would have introduced me to this much broader, cross-pollinated religious landscape of late antiquity that I think more people should be aware of if you're going to dive deep into this field.
Right. Yeah. Well, to write a dissertation, that model of academic training, where the end of it you're supposed to write a thesis or dissertation, that model, yeah, creates a very constricted, kind of narrow-necked bottle kind of a model, where in order to write that thing, you've got to be extremely focused and detailed. Whereas it would be interesting to think of an educational system, and again, this is where like YouTube kind of fills in the gaps here, but where you could be a true generalist and actually a Renaissance person. I won't say Renaissance man, but you really do know a lot. And this is something that my advisor, Harry Gamble, actually really was good at. Like he never pushed me anywhere. He just kind of tried to know everything. And he graduated in like 1968, and he used to say that, yeah, I could read everything published in New Testament studies in 1970, and of course by 1975, you couldn't do that anymore. And the field has just grown. So yeah, it's an interesting academic model, and I think we need to think, as online educators, we need to think seriously about other models of education that would be particularly directed at a population that's maybe between the ages of 35 and 70, where it's almost a process of re-education and of filling in kind of gaps, rather than that education, which is like training people for PhDs to go out and teach. I think we can be broad. I think Religion for Breakfast is a great example of a very, has the depth and the breadth. And thinking about how to do religious education with those skills is, I think it's an ongoing project.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there's only so much you can learn, obviously. So my bar is pretty low when I say I want somebody to be religiously literate. Like, you don't need to list every single Talmudic passage to know something about Rabbinic Judaism. But I liked your idea of, basic intros to certain things like the imperial cult, Mandeism, and stuff like that. So I mentioned earlier about the whole mantra of making the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. So I think we did a good job with, trying to make Valentinian Christianity a little more familiar. So instead of a very arcane metaphysical philosophy, we can think of it, in many respects, it was people trying to live daily life, trying to offer a practical morality. I think I said this in my intro to Hermeticism. Is in many respects, it's a practical theology for how you should live in the world. So what would be an example that comes to mind for you of trying to make something very familiar more unfamiliar? So if we're talking about the New Testament or the Apostle Paul, so much of that we take for granted because we're, especially in the United States, so steeped in Christianity. So we talk about the Trinity as if it's a very cut and dry thing, as opposed to something that's deeply difficult to understand and was hashed out over centuries of debate among Christian theologians. But what's something that's
so familiar, and how in your teaching do you try to make it a little more unfamiliar, just to try to shake up your students to think more deeply about something?
Well, it's interesting. As I've gotten more and more into Marcion, I've totally revised my understanding of Paul. And what I've noticed in the traditional courses like Life and Work of Paul, they never mention Marcion. But I think Marcion is one of those figures which can, even if you don't like Marcion, you can use Marcion to defamiliarize Paul. Uh, because, not a lot of people know that, Marcion, he probably doesn't give us the very first collection, but he's a witness to one of the earliest collections of Paul's letters, and that particular collection seems not to have had sections that have traditionally been considered Pauline. Obviously, most obviously the Hebrews, but the pastorals as well. And apparently, it's interesting when you look into Tertullian here, but this is a bit hard to tell, but it definitely seems like large chunks of Galatians were not there. And you have Romans 15 and 16 not there. Um, so, that's very interesting. Like, apart from the question of, well, who's doing the editing? And, is someone cutting this stuff out? Apart from that question, it's just interesting to think about a Paul that is not the exact same as what we might call what the Paul that the early Catholics, knew and loved, essentially the Paul of Acts. When you really get into the Paul of Marcion, he is a countercultural Paul. I mean, I must say, I have great respect for those who are today on the line of putting Paul within Judaism. I mean, there was Jesus within Judaism. We've had that ever since the 60s, really. But the Paul within Judaism has been very strong in the past 20 years or so. I have absolutely amazing respect for that kind of scholarship. But I think in a sense, that's very much scholarship that's post-Shoah scholarship, that it's scholarship of Christians who are, living in the wake of the Holocaust and wanting to renew and revive what was basically cut out by the Nazis, basically. And so that's our cultural concerns are driving us in the 20th and 21st century to present a certain version of Paul. And I think, looking at Marcion and trying sincerely to, say, reconstruct his text, either of the gospel or of the Pauline letters, is a really nice way to defamiliarize Paul and to think of Paul in terms of another set of cultural concerns, in this case, early second century cultural concerns, where there were, Christians were really interested in actually saying that, hey, we are distinct, and that's okay. But at the same time, they had debates about, well, what do we take from the Jewish tradition? What do we claim? What do we appropriate? Um, I don't want to be too nasty in the terminology. Maybe appropriation is not the most friendly term, but they surely wanted to claim part of Jewish history while also saying that we're not doing Jewish ritual. We don't do Jewish meetings. We don't do Jewish types of things. We are our own, we're our own band here. So I think, yeah, when reading Marcion, Marcion brings a couple things to the table with Marcion's Paul. First of all, it's a Paul that I would say is definitely um, on the line of that trajectory of Christianity where you've got what I like to call angelification traditions that are really important to Marcion. So, bodies of glory, getting a spirit body, those are passages really important to him. Anti-law passages, really important to him. But interestingly, he's still got Romans 7:12, where the law is wholly good. And, so how did he deal with that one? We actually don't know. But he was certainly wanting, I think, to say that Paul was something distinct from Judaism. And that's not going to be culturally like, you know, part of it's not going to be part of what we honor, but I think it's part of recognizing that ability of Christianity to birth itself and to become self-differentiated. You can sort of see that through the lens of Marcion.
Yeah, and this is so taken for granted today when we think of Judaism and Christianity as two separate religions. But there's this whole discourse within scholarship of the parting of ways. Like, when does that differentiation happen? Because I've often said that if Paul walked into a Christian church in the 21st century of any denomination, he would be very confused by what he was seeing. Like, it's just so different from the religious life he was living and the religious world he was living in. And so it's funny that it's so radical to say, well, Paul was a Jew, and think down that line of thought. How was he a cultural critic, a Jewish cultural critic writing about Judaism? Would have been a banal thing to say to him, even though it's an important part of defamiliarization in the 21st century, where we're trying to think of Paul not as like a proto-Protestant or even a Christian, but a Jew writing about Jewish topics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to this day, Adolf von Harnack, Marcus Vincent have still, thrown out the possibility that Marcion himself is Jewish. I mean, to be Jewish, I think, the tendency is to think like of your local synagogue, and of those forms of Judaism which emerged out of Rabbinic Judaism. And I think, one of the things that I treasure from John J. Collins is this wild and wonderful world of Hellenistic Judaism, and that enabled people like Paul, people like Marcion to do what they did, to be critics within the tradition, and then eventually to start a separate worshiping bodies, where they really truly were doing something new, regardless of whether they were aware of that newness or not. I think Marcion, certainly by his time, was wanting to push the novelty. But yeah, Paul, in terms of his own self-consciousness, was both new and doing a lot of things that he just thought were traditional. Sure.
So let's pivot to another corner of your expertise, which is the Gospel of Thomas. This might dial us back to earlier in our conversation about ethics and morality, because the Gospel of Thomas touches on a lot of really simple ethical teachings. Could you just tell us a bit about what is the Gospel of Thomas, first of all, and how this fits into our conversation so far?
Well, I love the Gospel of Thomas because it enables me to bring together those two interests of mine, which is to bring the historical critical aspect of scholarship to bear, but also to just present what I consider to be a spiritual masterpiece and a treasure to people who are thirsty for learning a different side, maybe of their own tradition, or they just like esoteric and more mysterious things. So the Gospel of Thomas presents itself as a kind of, an endless well of it says secret sayings of Jesus, and that you're supposed to think about these sayings and meditate on these sayings. And in the meditation, you find eternal life. So, you're not saved by the blood of a slain deity, wailing and dying on a cross. You are literally thinking these sayings, and that is your salvation. And as you point out, a lot of these sayings are stuff that are, straight up ethical. Some of the stuff is very surprising, where Jesus seems not to be happy to like give alms. But ethics is reversed in some respects, but one might say it is simply grown in another direction. So it becomes very ethically important in Thomas to be, as the text says, to be a monachos, to be solitary. And what exactly does that mean? I think it probably does have something to do with celibacy. It has a fairly, I wouldn't say negative view of the flesh. I don't think that any of these texts, maybe with the exception of the paraphrase of Shem, really have like a hatred of the flesh. But it's one of those texts which is clearly where the logic of it is meant to encourage you to engage in disciplinary action. That is, you are disciplining your body to reduce passions and really to get back to that state of, you know, Eden, basically, that state where everything was a great emotional calm and everything was provided for and everything was one, in a sense. Eve was still an Adam. So I think, you know, ethically, I'm not actually sure if it's exactly what someone would expect, you know, from Jesus, because it doesn't seem to be, you know, it's not like the Sermon on the Mount kind of ethics. It's a little bit more complex than that, and I think it's moving in a direction, in a more ascetic direction, which not everyone is happy to do. But I think that it is a treasure because it encourages people to think more seriously, again, in countercultural terms, and in terms that are maybe against our culture, you know, where family is so important and Christianity and family values, like, oh my God, like that's such an American thing, right? But, you know, you don't get that sense at all that family is important, from the Gospel of Thomas. You're supposed to be solitary. People are, you know, Jesus is coming with a sword, is going to be 5 against 2 and 2 against 5, you know, in the house. And yeah, so not family values, but still ethical, right? But ethical in a different way. A lot of people today have very much of a difficulty with like anything anti-sex attitude, like, because they love the body, and, you know, it's part of our culture to embrace bodily things, bodily pleasures, you know, indulge. This is what like the advertising world shows you, like show you a hamburger, you know, and so go to Mickey D's, you know. But I think the Gospel of Thomas is very useful because it's very countercultural in the sense that it tries to convince you that actually, no, you're not in the right platform. You're in what I like to call your wet platform, and there's a much higher life. There's a much higher life, a much higher kind of experience. Your true image above is something that isn't controlled by, you know, things like, oh my God, I'm hungry, you know, oh, I have to go to the bathroom, and oh, I have all these bodily needs. And, you know, eventually, you know, we all do get warts and we all do get wrinkles, and that's just a fact of life. I mean, we can celebrate beauty on the internet and on Facebook and show the prettiest side of our face, but the fact is we're all dying. We're all, you know, and I think, you know, again, the Gospel of Thomas is really helpful for making that absolutely plain and causing us to think in new directions, which maybe are countercultural, but are still very useful.
It's always surprised me a little bit that the Gospel of Thomas has been viewed as, you know, part of that forbidden knowledge, esoteric, when so much of it is, first of all, just versions of canonical gospel sayings that you can find in, you know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And aside from a few confusing kind of so-called Gnostic-y sounding verses, it's radical in its own sense, but it's not that surprising. You know, a texts that say, you know, avoid bodily pleasures, think on heavenly things is just not that different in the grand body of religious texts talking about living a more monastic lifestyle, a more ascetic lifestyle. So it's kind of interesting to me that it's kind of become this totem or touchstone of something that's Gnostic or secret or esoteric. And it does say that it is, you know, the secret sayings of Jesus, you know, told by Thomas, but it's not really, it's not so secretive when you think about the message.
Well, it's an open secret, right? That's the irony of secrecy. Like, a part of the secrecy is to draw people in. I mean, obviously, if you publish a book full of secrets, well, they're not really secret because publication itself is the revelation. There's no more secrets if it's published, right? It's sort of like me putting on the internet, you know, on my website, this is a secret doctrine. Well, not anymore. I just published it. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, there's a sociology of religion here that is going on. And obviously, the Gospel of Thomas has been caught within an inner scholarly cultural war. that's, affected by evangelical Christianity, because evangelical Christianity wants to say that, oh, well, if it's an early Jesus tradition, then it's probably reliable and based on eyewitnesses. So, we want to push the Gospel of Thomas as late as we can, because God forbid that it could have genuine Jesus material. But I think, ultimately, whatever date that you put the Gospel of Thomas, I think that it's not that it's irrelevant, but again, it's important to recognize that those are our cultural battles that we have, that we try to situate Thomas, as like, oh, the true and earliest gospel with the original Jesus. Well, I mean, in a sense, we are still growing out of that. Like, it doesn't really matter if this is a second century text, to me anyway. I think the final forms of the Gospels are also second century texts, early second century. So that's not really different. So I think for me, the question is, what is the model Christian reader here that's reading this text and benefiting from it? Because that's really obviously the kind of lens that we can take and, in a sense, recapitulate today, where we can also benefit from this text. And we can benefit from a text even if it's not a genuine saying of Jesus, or even if it's not the earliest record. Like, all of that, I think, to the first readers of this text, I'm not sure was that important. We see no emphasis in the text like, by the way, this is earlier than the form of the version in Matthew and Mark or Luke or something like that. I mean, they don't care about that. It's we who care about that. But they cared about the message and the content of the message. And I think it's really important to meditate on that.
Well, Dr. Litwa, thank you so much for joining. And for everyone, please check out Dr. Litwa's YouTube channel and his online, his public scholarship. Really great stuff.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, I really feel like we're partners and colleagues in a larger, educational revolution, where we're trying to do good on a platform which is filled with people who have a variety of purposes and ends. And I think, in a sense, what Religion for Breakfast is doing, or at least what I envision I'm doing, is providing a kind of counterculture where we're taking some of the tropes that we've learned from our academic training, and we're trying to apply them in a globosphere, like a sphere of online education, where we're learning how to do things like cite sources on YouTube well, and give people bibliographies and really lead them towards something like peer review. But the structure of YouTube was never designed for any of that. But we're still trying to do good things and to, support people and support ourselves in this wild world. And I think, it's an honor to be doing that with you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to go a little bit deeper, Dr. Litwa is giving a live lecture with us on August 4th at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern. Did Marcion write his gospel? Sign up now at religiondepartment.com/Marcion. Marcion was a 2nd century Christian theologian who launched one of the earliest and most widespread Christian movements, Marcionism. Marcion rejected many books that would eventually be canonized in the New Testament, but most notably, he accepted only one gospel, rather than the 4 gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Marcion's gospel appears to have been a shorter version of the Gospel of Luke, lacking its birth story and much of its narrative detail. His critics accused him of hacking up the Gospel of Luke to match his own theology, but recent scholarship is starting to question that narrative, arguing that Marcion compiled and published his Gospel before the Gospel of Luke. In fact, some argue that the Gospel of Luke may be a revision of Marcion's Gospel. Dr. David Litwa is an expert on Marcion, and he'll examine these claims. Although there is a strong case to be made that Marcion's Gospel predates canonical Luke, Dr. Litwa will argue that the idea that he wrote it himself is not supported by ancient evidence. The talk presents all of the data that has been used to argue that Marcion saw himself as a gospel author and a gospel publisher, and offers a point-by-point critique of how that data is interpreted. He'll also tackle big questions like, was Marcion really editing Luke to match his theology? We'll be holding this as a live lecture on Zoom with a Q&A session afterward on August 4th at 8 o'clock p.m. U.S. East Coast time. If you can't make the lecture live, we'll be recording it for everyone who registers, and registration costs whatever you want. I don't want costs to get in the way. Sign up now at religiondepartment.com/Marcion. Hope to see you there.